Well, welcome to my Sunday school class on bridges. Beg pardon? I cannot. Let me start by reading you some scripture here real quick. This is from the book of 1 Corinthians. I'm starting at verse 26. And Paul says this, "For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. And the base things of the world and despised God has chosen, things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. But by his doing you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, so that, just as it is written, let him who boasts boast in the Lord." And then again in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, if I can find that. Starting verse 1, Paul he's writing this letter to the Corinthians again, and he's bragging on the churches at Macedonia. And listen to what he says. "Now, brethren, we wish to make known to you the grace of God which has been given to the churches of Macedonia, that in a great ordeal of affliction, their abundance of joy and their deep poverty overflowed in the wealth of their liberality." So he's bragging about how they gave out of their poverty. And there's other passages in the New Testament that allude to that. So, as we go through the New Testament, as we read some of those scriptures, we sometimes get a little peek into the lives of the people that were there. And we do know when we go through Acts and some other things, we see that there are numerous instances in the New Testament where wealthy and prestigious or influential people come to know the Lord and provide a great help to the church at that time, with places to meet or money or different things of that nature. But for the most part, what we can gather is that the world of the New Testament believer, the people that started out in the church were at best they were pretty average, right? At worst they were below average. And in fact, if we listen to the church historians, what we find out, or at least what we think we know, is that a significant portion of the church consisted of slaves. Okay? And that the beautiful people of the time, if you will, the important and the influential, for the most part, considered Christianity itself to be ridiculous. So if that's the case, and you can't see my beautiful slides, so you'll just have to sort of imagine this, if you will. If that's the case, and we're pretty sure it is, then do you ever sort of ask yourself how we moved from a raggedy handful of laborers, of fishermen, and an itinerant preacher to the church that we have today? And I'm referring specifically to the Catholic Church. How did we get from that raggedy, poor band of people who Jesus tells somebody the foxes have beds or holes, and something else has beds, but I have no place to lay my head? How do we go from a homeless itinerant preacher to the pageantry and the beauty and just the sort of awesomeness that represents, if you've ever been to the cathedrals in Europe or anything like that, you see, even here in the States, you see some pretty nice churches. And how did we go from a handful of apostles, right, to this whole structure where you have the Pope and the bishops and the cardinals and all that scene? You ever wonder how that happened? I mean, doesn't it seem odd to you when you look at that? You think, how did we get there? How did that happen? Is that you, Darren?
Yeah, that's me. Because I guess looking back at just how Abraham, how it went, belief and faith in God, how that transcended to being Pharisees, and how similar I see somewhat how the fishermen progressed and are bent to have prestige and somewhat of a power hang up, even though it's Christian-based, went to catechism, kind of thing.
Well, you're right in that
Rules
it
that we seem to enjoy because we have rules all around us, and we implement more to guide that we think is best for us. But in essence,
it's an excellent observation.
strays us from the importance of the whole thing.
Better than anything I came up with, so I don't know, maybe we should switch. But I mean, Darren's right. I mean, essentially, it's human nature that brought us to the point we're at. And I would say, as we go through this, one of the things that struck me as I taught and learned about the history of the New Testament church, one thing that is very, very evident to me is I hope you're the same way, maybe you're not, but I always have a tendency to look at those Old Testament Jews and say, what a bunch of idiots. They had all this stuff happen to them. They could see the pillar of fire by night and the cloud by day. They could see all that. They crossed the Red Sea. They crossed the Jordan. They did all that, and they still rebelled. And that if you look at the New Testament, you see the same pattern. God redeems and people fall away. That's just what they do. Anyway, that's not really where I wanted to go with this morning. What I would like to talk to you, this is kind of just a trivia sort of class today, pretty much, but I just want to go through and tell you how did we get to the point. Basically, we're going to cover about 800 years this morning and the remaining, 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to be painting with a broad brush. I'm just going to warn you, and I'm definitely painting from a Protestant perspective. There's arguments about literally everything, every aspect of what I'm going to tell you this morning, but I want to just go through, because this has always been sort of curious to me, and tell you a little bit of how we got to where we're at, okay? So, Dennis, would you open us up in prayer?
Father God, we just want to thank you for the opportunity to gather together this morning to hear your word taught so clearly, rightly divided. Thank you, Father, for both the service this morning and opportunity to worship together. That's an encouragement, opportunity to hear Gary's message, and now to sit under teaching of Dave. And we just thank you for the time that he's invested to prepare. This is fascinating material, and we ask, Lord, that we would go away today encouraged and rejuvenated and just ever more anxious to live for you, to be in your word. We thank you now for this time. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Okay, so the first thing I would say is it seems pretty clear as we read through the New Testament, we read Paul's letters and some other things that are out there, and we've discussed a little bit about this before, but we know from Paul's writings what he did to set up church government. We know what his habits were and how he went about it. And, you know as well as I do, he would go into a town. First thing he'd do is go to the synagogue. He'd preach to the Jews. He'd get kicked out of there. He'd go to the Gentiles. And eventually he'd get enough believers that he would start a church. And when he did that, then he would set up elders and he would train the elders, and he would say, okay, now that you've been trained, I need you to train other men the same way that you've been trained. And then he'd move on, and the idea was that they would just continue to reproduce themselves in the local church, on and on. And we see that he did this. This is what his practice. We see that he commands both Timothy and Titus to do the same thing as they're setting up churches. And then we also see that the elders are mentioned in Acts. They're mentioned in 1 Peter, in Hebrews and James, and as well as Revelations. And in most of those instances, the writers of those books are encouraging people to obey their elders, to follow their elders, to support their elders. And so we know that in the apostolic age that the most common form of church government was to be led by what we would today call a plurality of elders. Okay, that's the way that they were set up. But when you think about that, and I'm kind of at a disadvantage maybe because I am on the elder board. Not that mean anything to you, but it's just that I get to see sort of a close-up view maybe that some of you don't ever see. But when you think about that, is it your impression that, you have, it's like the Knights of the Round Table, right? They're all sitting around this little table and they all have equal standing and they're making these huge decisions, that don't involve, should we cut the tree down or shouldn't we, or should we do something to the pond or not? but they're deep, weighty spiritual matters. But if we apply a little common sense to that, and if we kind of read between some of the lines that we see in the New Testament, I think we'll know that even from the earliest, probably parts of setting up the New Testament, that probably wasn't strictly, at least that vision that I just gave you, probably wasn't strictly the way it works. We know that in a human group, in any human group, right, that's gathered together to do something for a purpose, there's always going to be leaders that rise up out of that group. That's a given. That's axiomatic, right? That happens all the time. And we see Paul asserting his own authority over the churches and over the elders of the church as an apostle, the churches that he was involved with. We see him tell Timothy and Titus to do the same thing, to assert their authority in the churches at Crete and in Ephesus. And we see this too, even in the book of Acts. We see in the church in Jerusalem that was full of apostles and elders. As we read through the book of Acts, we see that James becomes more or less the sort of dominant figure in that church. And he's referred to over and over and over. So James is sort of the leader of the leaders, if you would have that. And so even the Apostle John, when he writes in his third epistle, the book of 3 John, he mentions a guy named Diotrephes. Now, this is before 100 AD, right? The apostles are still alive. John's writing a letter. This guy Diotrephes, he does not mention in a good manner, but he indicates that he has some sort of authoritative role in the church where he is able to put people out of the church if they're doing things that he disagrees with. And John says he's going to take that up with him when he sees him, but still we see this guy who has that kind of authority in the church. And so we're reading between the lines and knowing what we know about human nature, we kind of see that even in the first century, we have these churches that are being set up. They're led by a group of elders, but in most cases, there are one or maybe two elders that are sort of rising to the top, that are coming up with a little bit more maybe authority just out of a force of their own personality than the rest of them have. There's a leader among them. Okay, so some of us may be able to, or maybe thinking to ourselves, well, this is not the way it should be. That's not the way it's described. But I think if you think about it, you think even in our own church, we have a board of elders that sits, but few of us would argue that Gary carries more weight on that board than I do. Well, perhaps more weight is the wrong way to phrase that. At any rate, you get my point, right? I don't want to go into that very much. And so we get further confirmation of this throughout the writings of the New Testament church. You can't see this handsome guy on the screen that I have here, but his name is Clement of Clement of Rome. Okay, who is Clement of Rome? Well, in Philippians 4:3, Paul mentions a guy in the Philippian church named Clement. Some people think that that's who it is. We don't know that for sure, but what we do know is that eventually this guy Clement becomes a bishop at Rome. Now, you know that bishop and elder are used by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament interchangeably, right? Bishops and elders are the same thing. So apparently Clement is an elder, a bishop of the church at Rome, and he's holding office sometime in the late first century, say AD 80 to AD 100. Eventually he's martyred, or at least according to legend, and that's the end of him. But there is some evidence that Clement had personal contact with the Apostle Peter, and he may have studied under some of the other apostles. But here's what we do know about Clement that is pertinent to our class, and hopefully it will all come together to you eventually. Sometime in the mid-90s, the church, again, Clement is a bishop at Rome. Sometime in the mid-90s, our old friends, the Corinthians, start to experience more trouble, or at least the trouble that they're experiencing gets to the point where the church in Rome is aware of it. Okay, and it's the same problem they've always had. They have problems with unity, problems with different factions rising up in the church, doing all kinds of stuff, not paying attention to their elders, not following them. And so Clement, who is the elder at Rome, he takes it upon himself to write a letter to the Corinthians. And it's a nice letter. We call it the First Clement, actually, today. And you can find it. It might be in some of the apocryphal books or writings, things like that. But Clement writes this letter, and apparently they set a lot of store by Clement, and they say they're paying attention to him. But as he writes the letter, he's asking them to be united. He's asking them to follow their church leadership, the elders that are there. And as he does that, he goes back into that. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, into that idea of apostolic succession. He says, listen, your elders are put there. They were put there by apostles. They were trained by apostles. So therefore, that's the reason you should follow these men, because they're put there by apostles. So he's kind of building that chain. Hold on, I'm catching up with my notes here. So he's not doing anything that's really out of the ordinary. If we read through the New Testament, we see Peter, Paul, and the author of Hebrews all exhort their audiences to follow their elders. And so Clement's not doing anything sort of special. But what I want to sort of point out to you is this, is that Clement, again, is the Bishop of Rome, a Bishop of Rome. So what we have here, which is going to become sort of something we need to track, right, is a Roman bishop from the city of Rome writing to other churches in some sort of way that would indicate that he thinks he has authority to do that. Okay? This doesn't make Clement a bad guy. I'm just pointing this out to you, right? Okay. So the next guy we run into as we move along our 800-year timeline here is a guy named Ignatius of Antioch. Now, I don't have a map, but if you can remember your map of Palestine, Antioch is in Syria, essentially. It's just on the northern border of Palestine, like between Palestine and Asia, or Asia Minor, I guess they called it. He's down there, this guy Ignatius, he's another go-getter. Everybody seems to love him. Again, this is early, right? Ignatius is turn of the first century into the second century. So we don't know a lot about him. We don't have a lot of information. But what we do know was that he was not a bishop, but the bishop of Antioch. Okay? He's a contemporary and apparently a friend of a guy named Polycarp. I'm sure you've heard of him. He stuttered apparently under the Apostle John, and he is condemned to die, we think, by the Roman Emperor Trajan or Trajan or whatever his name is, sometime early in the second century. And the story of his martyrdom is kind of weird. He's captured in Syria where he's the bishop. The quickest way to get him, they take him to Rome, first of all, to kill him, which is unusual. And secondly, instead of just going in a straight line, taking him down to the coast, putting him in a ship and sail him to Rome, they apparently take him on a land journey all the way through Asia. Nobody knows really why they did this, but they did it apparently. And as they did that, they let people come see him. Other Christians would come and visit him, and as they did these things, then he would write letters. And he wrote letters. He's famous for 7 different letters. He wrote one of them to Polycarp and then 6 to other churches, okay? 5 of those 6 churches are churches in Asia. One of them is a Western church. That church is Rome, okay? Now Ignatius, stop it. There, hold on. Ignatius is important to our discussion because he is the first person we have in history that we can find who makes a clear distinction between the phrase bishop and elder. And so when in these letters that he's writing to, and when he writes the letters to the 6 churches in Asia, he's writing them to bishops, right, to individual people. He's writing them to the church, but they're going through the bishops. And he makes a distinction between the bishops and the elders. And He goes as far as to say this: wherever the bishop appears, there let the people be, even as wheresoever Christ Jesus is, there is the universal church. It is not lawful apart from the bishop either to baptize or to hold a love feast. Okay? So Ignatius not only makes a distinction, but he goes on to say, if you don't have a bishop, you don't have a church. Okay? We would maybe see this as the senior pastor today, right? And he says, if in fact you don't have a bishop, then you cannot baptize and you cannot have the Lord's Supper. That requires a bishop, according to Ignatius. Okay? So he's writing to these churches. He's doing it in order to combat Gnosticism and Docetism that we talked about a few weeks ago. But as he does this, he addresses them that way. And he seems to think that the best way to do this, one second, Dan, is to, he's still in for a board of elders. He's still in for that. But he seems to think that one predominant leader whose credentials are impeccable, that you can trace back to an apostle, is the best way to guard against this sort of Gnostic or heretical intrusion. Okay? Okay, Dan, did you say?
Well, I was just going to ask, and I think you started to answer it there. So is this the beginnings of apostolic succession?
Yes. But you just, now I got 30 minutes. We're just standing here to look at each other. So that's exactly right, though. This is what we're seeing, okay, is the idea of apostolic succession. Now, we talked about this once before. Remember, these guys, when they're talking about apostolic succession, they're talking about the succession of truth, not necessarily authority. Okay, that's going to be switched in the future, but they are. That's exactly where I'm going with this. Is that idea is being born here, right in the very beginning stages of the church. The interesting note to see here is that, again, in 5 of the letters that he writes to churches, he writes to a bishop and implies that they have bishops. In one church, he does not even mention bishops. He doesn't mention a bishop. That church is the Roman church. Okay, so it looks like when Ignatius wrote this letter that at least the church in Rome was governed. We know it had bishops, right, because Clement was a bishop. But it looks like they're still being governed by a board of equal elders in which they're not making any distinction between bishop and elder. But that's not true of Ignatius in general. Okay. Again, now before we come down too hard on poor old Ignatius, I think it's important to point out that what he's advocating for here is, although we wouldn't go about it maybe as aggressively as he would, but when you think of an elder-led church here in the 21st century, are we on the 20? Yeah, it's 21st. 21st century America, it's pretty much the same thing, right? We have a board of elders in an elder-led church, but there's always one elder who stands out. And in our case, it's our senior pastor who holds a more decisive role, if you will, as in church leadership. You see where I'm going here? So this isn't anything crazy that he's talking about here, but he's the first person to make this argument. And then we're back to our old friend Irenaeus, whose notes, there they are, okay? We remember Irenaeus from our discussion on Gnosticism. He's the guy who made such a strong case. He's the first guy to actually sit down and write out his logical case for what we call this idea of apostolic succession, and he does it in combating Gnosticism. Again, he's talking about the succession of truth, not authority. But again, we see he's not the first to raise the idea, but he is the first to actually sort of codify it, to sit down and make a logical argument about why we need apostolic succession, why it's important in order to fight this Gnosticism. And again, as we went through all that, it seemed to make pretty good sense to me. Dan?
I think it's important to remember, though, that at this point, there's no canon, and all of these churches wouldn't necessarily have all of the books of the New Testament. So in terms of truth passing down, it makes some sense that you want to have people who've been taught by the apostles, because it's not like they've all got Bibles.
Absolutely. His argument's flawless. I mean, when he's you know, maybe you missed it. You were probably out gallivanting around the universe. But when we talked about Gnosticism, we see that, you know, even then, who are you again? Irenaeus mentions 22 of the 27 books we have in the canon. So the canon's out there. It's just maybe not formalized as a canon. They know what books are authoritative. They also know who the apostles taught. They can, at these churches, they can trace them back. And as again, you know, we can see that was a great way to guard against a heresy. So again, nothing too radical here, but this idea of apostolic succession is beginning to build, and the idea of one leader is beginning to build as we go through time. Okay, so now we fast forward like, I don't know, 100 years, 75 anyway. We run into this guy named Cyprian of Carthage. Carthage is down in what we call Tunisia now, northern Africa, right? And it's a major Christian city by the time this rolls around. I forgot his name. Where you at? Cyprian. Cyprian's down there. He is the bishop of Carthage. Okay, he's sort of a reluctant bishop. He really didn't want to be a bishop too bad, but they made him a bishop. And in the early 3rd century, remember that's the 200s, right? Persecution against Christians breaks out as a result of an edict by the emperor named Decius. Okay, and apparently down in Carthage, the persecution is really bad. Okay, so Cyprian, he apparently has both the means and the ability, so he decides that discretion is the better part of valor, and he takes off. He leaves Carthage to work from home, if you will. He's going to be sending in letters and things like that to the Carthaginians who are undergoing the persecution, but he's sort of outside that circle. Okay, so he does that. He's out there. He's trying to encourage them. He's writing letters. Excuse me. And while he's doing that, there are a lot of Carthaginian Christians who are being killed for their faith, tortured and killed, right? And a lot of others, when they face the prospect of being tortured or killed, are saying, we're not so sure about this, and they recant their faith. So you get two sort of groups building there in Carthage, and probably all over the world, but it kind of comes to a head in Carthage. So to make a long story short, eventually the persecution runs its course. Cyprian returns to Carthage and resumes his duties as a bishop. Okay? Now, again, to be fair, he didn't really stop doing his duties as a bishop. He was just doing them from a distance. Okay? So you can imagine that this creates a little bit of an issue. There's a few people that are not excited about Cyprian having made his escape during the worst of the persecution, now coming back. And I think there's a few other reasons that perhaps they didn't like Cyprian. One thing I would, we go through a lot of names, and I told you when we started this course that we weren't going to be heavy on names. You don't have to know them or anything like that. One thing I would tell you, though, when you study these early church fathers, you find out that they're early church fathers, they are not infallible. So we have these guys that we are really, really grateful for, who did tremendously helpful things for the Christian faith in its early course, but many of them held ideas that would border anyway on heretical at times. Some of them, drifted in and out of stuff like that. Some of them ended up having, latching on to ideas that we would consider heretical. But God still used them, same as he uses you and me. And so, I'm not telling you they weren't Christians, but I am telling you they weren't perfect. So if you do read about them, don't expect to find that. Or don't be surprised when you find, other people saying, oh, yeah, that guy was a heretic. Anyway, so Cyprian creates a little bit of a stir when he comes back, but he is able, through whatever means, to sort of defend himself, and he becomes restored or reconfirmed, or whatever the word is that He is back in charge there in the city of Carthage. He's back as the bishop of Carthage. And now he has another controversy that he has to deal with, because all around the Roman Empire, this same situation has been building up. And the question now for Cyprian is, what are you going to do with the people who recanted their faith during the persecution, but now want to recant their recantment and come back into the fold? What are you going to do with them? Okay, you got people out there saying that all you need to do is repent and come back into the fold. And you got other people, oddly enough, another bishop at Rome saying there's nothing you can do. Once you make that step, you're done. You cannot ever come back into the church. So Cyprian, I don't know, maybe it's because of the experience he had, when he left town or whatever, or maybe he felt a little guilty, or I don't know. Maybe he was just a generous guy, but he comes down in the middle. And Cyprian's a well-respected individual, and this decision that he came up with that sort of good for everybody made him even more respected. And what he came up with was that if you're a Christian and you recanted your faith during the persecution, you can indeed come back into the church, but you can't do it easily. You have to perform some sort of public penance, and be judged by the bishop to come back in. And that was his real sticking point. The reason he came down in the middle like that instead of more lenient is because it was driving Cyprian crazy that some of these Christians who had recanted their faith were just going to an elder or somebody else in the church and saying, hey, I've repented, I want to come back. And that person was saying, okay, that's fine. Come on in. And Cyprian thought that should be the purview of the bishop only. He should be the only person to be able to make that decision. Okay? He also seemed to think in some of his writings that he championed this idea that we've just been talking about, that there should be one bishop who is more elevated than all the other bishops. He called it the chair, and that in every situation that there should be one bishop who's greater than all the other bishops or elders. And he based that on the idea that, what he said was that particular bishop. Now remember, he's not talking about just being at Rome. He's down in Carthage, but he's saying that particular bishop should be able to trace his spiritual lineage back to Peter, because Peter was the first of the apostles because of Christ's comment to him about, on this rock I will build my church. Okay, so that's the first time we see that idea sort of popping up here in history. Oh, this would be so nice. Anyway, so the next guy we talk about isn't even a church father. The next guy we want to talk about is a Roman emperor named Constantine. But before I tell you about Constantine, I got to tell you about a few other things, okay? So what's important for you to remember is this is not happening in a vacuum. None of this stuff that's going on here with the church is happening just to the church. We got the Roman Empire's out there still chugging away, doing its thing. There's thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, there is millions of people all throughout the Roman Empire going on with their daily activities, doing their daily stuff, living, dying, yelling at their kids, all that stuff. They're just doing this, right? And in the midst of that, Rome starts experiencing a crisis. Now they're overextended on all their borders. They've got a lot of domestic crisis going on at this time for whatever reason. There's plagues and all kinds of stuff going on, and there's these barbarian tribes on the borders that are just constantly attacking, right, taking off little pieces and things like that. And the Roman Empire now this would be the 3rd century, almost falls apart. But we get a new emperor. His name is Diocletian. He comes in and he starts reforming different things. And one of the things he does is that he splits the empire into an eastern and western portion. The eastern portion being Palestine, Asia, and all points east, and the western being Macedonia and Greece and Rome and all points west, right? First he splits it in 2 parts, and then later he splits it in 4. And he has a little emperor over each part, okay? And then as that's happening, we have strife within the Christian church, right? We actually have these bishops of these different towns that have been popping up, these different churches, and now they're starting to, they've exerted their authority over their own churches, and so now they're starting to try to exert authority over other churches. For instance, we have a guy named Demetrius, the Bishop of Alexandria, in the early 3rd century. He issues a decree against some Palestinian churches because they have taken a guy named Origen that went to his church. Origen's another famous church father, and they brought him over to their sphere of influence, and I think they made him into a priest, or they were listening to his teaching without him being properly, what do we call that when we have ordained? You know, so he's not been approved of by this Bishop Demetrius. He hasn't given his stamp of approval on him. So he actually writes decrees of punishment against these Palestinian churches. Of course, they don't pay any attention to him, but the idea here is that he's trying to exert his authority, right? There's a Victor, a bishop of Rome in the late 2nd century. He tries to, now remember, we've got that Rome isn't divided yet when Victor comes on the scene, but we still have the Eastern churches and the Western churches, and there's friction that's developing between them. Anyway, so Victor, he's at this time he is the bishop at Rome, right? He excommunicates or tries to excommunicate some of these people, some of these bishops in the Eastern churches because they don't have Easter on the right day, according to him. So there's a big fight over when Easter is supposed to be celebrated. Not when it is, when it's supposed to be celebrated, with the Bishop of Rome trying to excommunicate. And again, they told him to go pound sand, but you see the idea, okay? So there's a growing tension in between the Eastern churches and the Western churches. After the Diocletian division, that tension would continue to grow. You know, the Eastern churches would all stay Greek-speaking. The Western churches would all begin to speak Latin. You know, and just different things would go on, okay? Also, we think that maybe the monastic system started to develop about this time, right? Where some guy would decide he's going to be super spiritual, and he would go out and live as a monk, and then somebody else would say, well, I'm going to do what he's doing. And so they would all go out and live together as monks, and this is a weird thing for us, but it was happening, and some of these monasteries and stuff were completely excluded from life in general, but some of them weren't. And they were sending out missionaries, and they were sending out missionaries up into the barbarian lands of the Roman Empire. Okay? So what does all this have to do with Constantine? Well, in 306, Diocletian, not that you have to remember that, but he steps down. He's the only Roman emperor to ever just step down. He steps down. There's a power vacuum, bunch of people, because he's left 4 people out there, you know, kind of hanging in the breeze. And so Constantine, I'm sure you guys have all heard the story of Constantine and his victory in the sign of the cross. I'm going to really start moving here, I think, but he wins. He becomes emperor of the entire Roman Empire, and he takes Christianity and makes it the state religion, right? So overnight, Christianity moves from persecution, you know, it's illegal to be a Christian, to, oh, we're part of the cool kids now, right? I mean, virtually overnight. It's not literally overnight, but in the space of 20 years for sure, right? So this is a great thing for the Christians in terms of persecution, okay? But it comes with some strings attached, okay? So the problem with it is that he's the emperor, and now he's a Christian, and so the first thing he does is he sets a precedent for the emperor to be involved in the church. And so the political church lines begins to get blurred a little bit because he's moving back and forth in between them. And then additionally, I'm really late. He brings Christians into positions of power within the government organization. They've never done that before. You know, I mean, I'm sure there's been some people that had positions of power that were converted, but now they're being brought into positions of power just because they're Christians, okay? So what do you think that does to the church, right? Now you got people joining the church, they're not Christian at all, but they see that it's an advantage, and they start doing that. And plus that, you got the Roman emperor now sticking his nose into the church business, okay? So obviously that doesn't get better, and it only make things worse. But so what do we have here? We got the political lines in the church are getting blurred. We've got a precedent of one bishop being over a church. There may be elders underneath him, but one guy certainly in charge of all this. And we have these different bishops who are claiming apostolic succession, and now they're trying to take their authority and bring it over other bishops and other churches, right? So we can see all that playing out through history. Constantine, is trying to make things a little better, so he does a few things, but I'm babbling here. What I want to tell you is this: Rome, because of its position now, even though the Roman Empire is struggling, Rome has a prestigious position, and so that Roman bishop begins to take on more of a leading role. In 402, the Bishop of Rome, who we call now Pope Innocent, declared that no important decision could be made on behalf of the church. And he's talking about the universal church now, without the express approval of the Bishop of Rome. Big deal, you say? We don't have to pay attention to that. A few years later, another bishop of Rome, a guy named Zosimus, would declare that no one could even question a decision made by the Bishop of Rome. And then, in 455 AD, almost at the very end of the Roman Empire, a Roman emperor, Constantine's dead, it's 150 years later, named Valentinian III, issues an edict in support of the Bishop of Rome, which read as follows: "But in order that even the least disturbance may arise among the churches, or the discipline of religion appear in any instance to be weakened, we decree by this perpetual edict that it shall not be lawful for the bishops of Gaul or other provinces, contrary to the ancient custom, to do anything without the authority of the venerable Pope of the Eternal City." So I hate to read quotes because I know you don't follow them that well, at least I don't when I'm sitting there, but basically what he's saying is every single other bishop in every other province is subject to the Bishop of Rome. That's the emperor's edict. 30 years later, 150 years after Constantine, Rome is sacked and the Western Empire officially falls apart. Okay, this is almost immediately after this is doing this. So here you have the situation. Rome is sacked by the Visigoths in 410. That was even before that statement was made. It's sacked by the Vandals again in 455, and then finally in 476. The emperor that's sitting on the throne is deposed by some Germanic chieftain, and the world goes crazy, right? There's people, little tribes of people doing all kinds of stuff. There's a huge power vacuum, okay? And there's only one Roman institution that's still functioning well enough to be seen as any kind of authority. You know what it is? It's the church. It's not the mafia. They may have been there, but they were on the outs at the time, okay? So everybody starts looking to the Roman church. Everybody starts looking to the Bishop of Rome. In 590 AD, there was a new pope named. His name was Pope Gregory. This guy was a ball of fire, okay? Pope Gregory, they call him Gregory the Great now, Pope Gregory the First. He comes in, he starts doing all these different things. Here, I'll just read you this. Gregory successfully navigated the city of Rome through famines, plagues, devoted significant resources to help the poor, negotiated peace with the invading Lombards, whatever they are. Gregory was a prolific writer, most known for a bunch of different stuff, right? They think he might have also developed the Gregorian chant, but that doesn't have a lot to do with us either. Anyway, so Gregory is this great guy. He is charismatic. He comes in. He's helping people with the plague. He's making deals with the invading armies. He does all this, and he's the Bishop of Rome. And so the line is completely blurred now. Gregory is the political leader. He's also the spiritual leader, and that just gets solidified, okay, as the remnants of this Western Roman Empire kind of limp on, right? And then the Pope continues to grow, or I shouldn't call him Pope, I guess. The Bishop of Rome continues to go in power and prestige, and, you know, things just continue on like that. And finally, it gets to the point that in 800 AD, a French king named Charlemagne comes back into the Roman Empire and conquers some other places, and they proclaim him to be the emperor of the old Roman Empire, and it's a pope, Pope Leo II, who puts the crown on his head. So if the Pope puts the crown on your head, what is that signifying? He has the ability to do it, right? That he's an authority over you. And so we see by 800 AD that when Charlemagne takes that crown, he proclaims himself, or somebody proclaims him anyway, the emperor of what they term now as the Holy Roman Empire. And that is how we moved from 12 fishermen to a guy in a Pope hat in a College of Cardinals. Pope Gregory set all that up, that College of Cardinals, and he did the purgatory stuff, the venerating of saints. A lot of this stuff goes back to Gregory, but he was a very influential man, and he really solidified the idea of having a pope who was not only the spiritual leader of the world, but the political leader as well. So, in case you ever wanted to know, thanks for coming.